Hi, I'm Jayson Rivest, and today I'd like to share with you a technique that I have found personally helpful in releasing both fear and anxiety, particularly the fear surrounding what others think of you. I call this technique the power of so what? It's actually several techniques rolled into one, and it didn't start out as a technique at all. It actually came from a conversation that I had with a friend of mine in my early 20s. She happened to be down visiting from San Francisco. She was visiting my roommate and I. And oftentimes when she would visit, she and I would stay up until all hours of the morning talking about just about anything. And so this particular visit was no different in that we found ourselves greeting the next day, and we had talked about pretty much everything going on in our lives. You know, we talked about work and relationships and those sorts of things. And what I found in that conversation was that while I had a fair amount of professional success, I wasn't having that same level of success in my personal life. And my friend happened to comment on this, and so we began to discuss it. And so I would begin to describe to her different scenarios of things that I had wanted to do but found myself not doing ultimately. And so to each one of these scenarios, her response was always, why? And so I would give her what I thought at the time was a legitimate or reasonable explanation as to why. And what it always turned out to be was that I was concerned about what other people might think about me if I did whatever it was I wanted to do. And so her response every time was, so what? So what if you do this and they think that? She said to me, what's the worst thing that could happen? It's the worst thing that could happen. Well, I happen to have a very vivid imagination, and so my fear fantasies of the worst thing that could happen were really outrageous and far out of scale with anything that could possibly have happened in reality. And so just by allowing myself to give voice to what my fears were in a way that made me realize how out of scope my fear was compared to the reality of the situation, that helped me to diminish greatly the power that these fears had over me. Now, so the technique basically is those two questions. So what? And what's the worst that can happen? Now, the power of that is, when I was in college, I had studied psychology, and one of the things we talked about was cognitive therapy. And sometimes when you're experiencing a state of anxiety or anything sort of tied to an irrational emotion, what you need to do is you need to stop yourself to get out of that sort of mindset. And so you could use any phrase, but I particularly find the phrase "so what" to be very helpful because it's a little bit flippant, and for me that's a little bit different than the way I would normally speak. So that's the first part, is stopping yourself from following that irrational emotion down, its rabbit hole. The second part is the question, what's the worst thing that could happen? Now, the power in this, like it was for me, is in being able to prepare and plan ahead for whatever it is your fear is. And, your imagination may not be as vivid as mine, and so you could actually be imagining a plausible reality of something that could happen. And where the power comes in is that just by planning ahead, you're already prepared if that worst thing does happen. And then, of course, when you do whatever it is you're planning to do, and the worst thing doesn't happen, all the better. Now, one of the things that I want to talk about briefly here is that other people's opinions of you are actually none of your business. That was a hard lesson for me to learn, and I've actually got another friend who tells me this all the time. And so the thing is, He's absolutely right. What other people think is their own thoughts. Whether or not they think that about you behind your back or if they're that way with you up front, what they think about you doesn't really ultimately matter. You shouldn't necessarily be living your life based on what others think about you. Now, hold on, I know. There are some people whose opinions should matter. People like, your spouse or your family or your close friends, and maybe even your employer, if you want to stay employed. But the thing is that their opinions are just that, their opinions. And they are based on what their needs, expectations, and desires for their interaction with you are. And so, while I would like to think that everyone can be altruistic and want the best for you, and many people actually do, they can't help but filter in some of their own desires and wishes for you. And so you should always take other people's opinions under advisement, but remember that this is your life to live. And so, don't necessarily live for other people, but figure out what it is that really gets you going, that really fires you up and makes you feel vital and alive. And those are the things you should do. And the next time you find yourself not doing something because, you're worried about what someone might say, just remember, so what? What's the worst thing that could happen? I hope you find this technique very helpful. And if you like this tip and would like to hear more of tips like this and ways to unlock your potential and release fear and even tap into some of your hidden creativity, please go ahead and subscribe to my channel here on YouTube. And that way there you won't miss a single episode. And of course, if you would like to leave a comment on any feedback that you have about this technique, or if you have any questions, please do so in the comment section below. Now, I want you to have an amazing weekend, and if you happen to be anywhere that is experiencing a heat wave like we are here in Southern California, remember that it's important to stay hydrated. If you are thirsty, you are already dehydrated. So drink plenty of water, stay safe, and have an amazing weekend.